Native Compose navigation is probably one of the things that people have the most disagreements with how it was implemented. But I just wanted to do kind of a basics of Native Compose navigation for someone that has never done any Native Compose navigation before, but has messed around with Compose. So let's jump into Android Studio so you can see what I'm talking about here. So just to familiarize ourselves with kind of this project that I've set up as an example, we have an app with two screens. We've got a home screen and a note screen. So it's a note-taking app. The home screen just shows a list of notes, and the note screen allows you to both create those notes and view them once they've been created. So as you can see here, I've got this super simple setup, close out that, where we are just remembering an enum that I've created. It has the different screens that are possible, and when I click a button, I change that screen, and that's how I'm using this when statement to switch between the two, right? So this is kind of what somebody would come up with if they have, if they didn't want to really mess around with Native Compose navigation, and they just kind of wanted fastest route to get something on the screen. This might be the first thing that you come up with. So we're going to be taking this and kind of translating it to Native Compose navigation. All right. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're just going to come and we're going to create a new file called navigation. And in this file, yeah, sure, we'll add that to Git. That's probably good. You'll notice that, I deleted this file so I could recreate it because I was practicing. Anyways, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a composable function, and it's going to be called navigation. And this function, oh, I misspelled navigation. That's awkward. This function, its purpose is to house a navigation. So what's it going to have? Well, if you look at the docs for Compose navigation, you're going to see that what you're going to need basically is a nav controller, and you're going to need a nav host. So let's get ourselves a nav controller. And the way that you do that is by calling remember nav controller, and that's it. And then to get a nav host, you're just going to call nav host, and you're going to pass in that nav controller that you just created. You'll notice that it said graph. If you had previously, like if you were doing a conversion between an app that already uses the navigation component, and now you're going to be doing it in Compose, and you already built out that nav graph, you could reuse that. But here we're building out a fully new nav host, and you'll notice that it's still not happy. And the reason that it's not happy is that it needs to know what our start destination is. And we haven't really built this out yet, so for right now, we're just going to call that an empty string, and we're going to say to do. So what do we need? We need a way to navigate to our home destination, and we need a way to navigate to our note destination. And how are we going to do that? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to basically wrap those destinations in a composable lambda. Composable, this nav graph builder composable. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a nav backstack entry for you for that screen. And it's going to create it as a destination in this nav graph. And so let's just start by putting our home screen in there, and we will deal with these later because we haven't actually created our note screen destination yet, so we don't know how to navigate there yet. You'll notice that this composable is not happy, and that's because it requires a route. And what's a route? A route is just a string that identifies this particular destination. So for this home screen, that can be something as simple as home. Then we're going to come back now to this start destination. We know that our home screen is our start destination, and so this start destination is just going to be the route of the composable that you want to start your nav graph off on. So we want to start off on the home screen. So our start destination is going to be home, and then it's going to look through all of the screens that you've put there and say all the destinations that you've put in this nav graph builder, and it's going to say, do any of these have that route? And so it's really important that the route be exactly the same, because if it's not, you'll get a crash. Cool. So that's the first step. Now we're going to do the same thing for our note screen. And this will be a little bit more complicated on purpose because now our note screen, it's going to need to know which note that the user clicked on, or if the user clicked on the create new note. Right, and so what we're going to do here is first we're just going to say, let's say that its route is going to be note. And the question becomes then, how do I get that information? And so some people would say that what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pass all of the information about that note through the there's an argument section. So if you type it out in, you can do a list of arguments. And some people are going to say, well, if you can't do parsables or anything like that, you can only do primitive types through these arguments. And so some people would say, okay, pass through all of the primitive types of your data class. So in this case, we have a note, it's a data class, it's got an ID, a title, a description, and a date. They would say pass through all 4 of those primitive types, and then construct your data class that way. But if you actually look at the documentation, what Google suggests is that you save all of your, if you're going to pass something between 2 different destinations on your nav graph, you should persist it locally, like in Room Database or something like that, pass its ID along, and then fetch it back down in your new screen. So that's what we're going to do, right? So when we create our navigation argument, nav argument, we're going to call it note ID, because that's what we're going to pass along, and it's going to be nullable. Now our note ID is actually a long, but if you look through and go, and this is something that I do quite frequently, is look at the actual implementation of these things, because it is open source. If you look in here, and you can find this in the documentation as well, but long types are not allowed to be null. Null values are not supported, it says. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pass it through as a string, and then we're going to convert it to a long, so that we can support null. The other thing is that you could explicitly specify here that the type is nav type string type, but that's the default anyway. So you could explicitly state it, but I'm not going to because it's the default. Cool. So now we're getting our node ID. But there's one more thing you have to know about arguments, and that is that when you are constructing your route, it is supposed to be constructed like a URL, basically. And so you can pass, your arguments are supposed to be part of that URL. So instead of just the word note, I'm going to have note and then the note ID. And there's a couple different ways you can do this. So I'm going to demonstrate that here. If you require a note ID, for example, then just like if you were constructing a URL, this is what that would look like. Hold on, let's do required. Right, so you would say note slash, and then you would put curly braces and then note ID. And that would make that note ID required. If it's optional, then you're going to say note question mark note ID equals, and then now you're going to throw those curly braces in note ID. And then if you have multiple optional parameters, just like you were in the URL, you're going to say and is create. Maybe that's the next one. Equals is create. And so here, you could append as many optional parameters as you wanted. And we also have a situation where you had a required parameter. Let's call it color. Maybe you always have to set a color for some reason. But you could have a required parameter, and then you could have, optional parameters, and you could have as many of those as you wanted. So for us, I already created this, but I just typed this out here. But yeah, so we have an optional node ID, so that's the one we're going to use. And so let's replace our current route with this new route. And so that's going to have that pass through. So the next step is now, how do I get that node ID down to the note screen, get the note out of my local storage, and display that note. Now what you could do is this Lambda exposes the nav backstack entry. And so there you could find the arguments that you passed. Arguments. And you can say get string, and then you could say node ID, and that's how you get your node ID, and then you could pass that somewhere, your view model, and you could get your note that way. But something really cool actually happens when you pass an argument in navigation, and that is that if you go to your view model, we can actually retrieve that argument through a view model's save state handle. And so all you're going to have to do is, so I'm going to say existing node ID, and obviously some of this stuff is some boilerplate code that I had created prior to this video. But the important part is that you can, you gotta put val to be a variable. Don't know if you knew that. You can retrieve that argument through the save state handle, and so we say that was node ID, and its default value is null, and it's nullable string, and so yeah, and that's just gonna populate there like magic. Basically, the first time that I saw that it just goes straight from the arguments bundle into your save state handle in your view model. It felt like magic. And then what you can do here is I'm just going to map off of my existing node ID, and it's nullable. So I'm going to say that, and then I have my repository that I can get my node ID. And if you remember, my node IDs are actually longs, but I passed it through as a string because I want it to be nullable. Too long. And now that'll work out for us, and we don't need this function anymore because that was just for the other way of navigation. But now we don't need that anymore because we have this new way. Cool. So now that's how we're going to get our note. And so then where am I going to pull this note out of? We're going to pull it out of the view model, but where do I actually want to do that? Do I want to do that here? So I prefer personally to have kind of a stateful, composable version of my screens in which I instantiate that view model. And so what that looks like is, I have my view model, and it's a note view model equals view model, and then I can grab my note from that view model, view model dot note dot collect state, and then I have this stateless version of note screen, and I'm going to pass through all of its parameters in this stateful version. And so let's pass that note through, update note, so we're going to say view model update note, on back pressed, So we actually, that's the one thing that we're going to have to pass to this note screen is on back pressed. But I'll be able to do that, no problem. And then in save note, we're going to call viewModel.save note. And I'm also actually going to call on back pressed, so that once you save the note, you go back to the home screen so that we can see that that was in fact saved. Yeah. So then now we have this stateful version of note screen, and so it'll be a lot simpler to put in here. And we just have to say on back pressed. And what do we want to do? We're probably going to want to navigate up, right? So just go to the last entry in the backstack. And so now the last thing we actually have to do is just, So now we're going to get to the part that most people hate about Compose. So the two things that people hate about Compose is having to write these URLs, and then the other thing is now that I actually want to navigate to that destination, I'm going to call a nav controller .navigate, and now I have to pass in a route. And so for that note route, it's going to be note ID equals, and then I'm going to pass in it.id. So onClick note receives a note, and so I can navigate to that note ID by passing it into that string. And then the way that we are going to create notes is the same way, except the ID is null. Oop. So then the thing about this that people hate is that this is really error prone, right? Especially if you have, if you start getting into really complex projects where you're passing, a ton of data around, this can get really annoyingly complex and error prone, because you have to make sure that everything is spelled right, and everything's, if you have a lot of required parameters and whatever, you have to make sure everything's in the right order, and that's just not very fun. And so I'm making another video. This is part 1. I'll make another video on how I think there's a good way that you can simplify that for yourself. But we're still in this video, and the last thing we have to do is actually call this navigation function somewhere. And so we can get rid of this enum class, and now instead of all of this custom logic, we just actually call navigation. And I realize now that I never actually showed you guys what the app looked like, which is a poor experience on my part, but this is what the app looks like. You'll see it now. And so right now we don't have any notes. You can click create note, and we'll say this is note number 0. Programmers, obviously we start with 0. This is the start of something new. Yeah, we'll pretend that's spelled right. Let me click save. It's saved locally. It's here. I can click on it. I navigate there. I can click the create, and now I'm creating another one. This is note number 1, and this is going to say that on it. And so now we have both of our notes in that list. We can click on both of them, or we can create a new one, or we can back out and you can see that that's not created. But yeah, so like I said, this is part 1, and in the next video we're going to explore what are some ways that we can mitigate the risks of, if everybody knows your route, but they don't necessarily know the internals of how your screen works. They might think that they can navigate using certain parameters, but really, if you have 3 optional parameters and really 2 of them are required together, and 1 of them isn't required, or vice versa, you know what I'm trying to say. Somebody thinks that they can navigate with just 1 of them, and then the internal logic of your screen breaks. So we're going to explore how you can get some more type safety, get some more safety just in general with your navigating. But yeah, thanks for watching.